is surprisingly difficult to talk about. Hi, I'm Meg, and I have a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder, along with a few other diagnoses that include an eating disorder. And in this video, I'm going to be talking about my experiences with my eating disorder, mainly focusing on how it came about and how I live with it now after diagnosis. I know some of you probably clicked on this video because of the with pictures in the title, so here they are. Yeah, they're not of me, they're of cats. That's because showing pictures of me at my lowest isn't going to be helpful. It's triggering for a lot of people, and it just contributes to the sensationalization and the stereotypes that people with eating disorders are always underweight. That's not true at all, and the last thing I want to do is trigger people or add to that stereotype. There will be some illustrative pictures later in the video, but they're just of my face, and it's just because I wanted to illustrate the difference between how alive I look now and how sad and drawn I looked in the depths of my eating disorder. So I really hope that those aren't triggering for people, but I will put a warning when they're going to come up later on, so you can skip them if you want to. So, back to my story and my eating disorder. My case is slightly complicated because I've always had a bit of a weird relationship with food. I have a chronic illness that's diet controlled. I have celiac disease, and before I was diagnosed with that, I knew that eating certain foods and just eating in general sometimes made me feel really ill and caused me a lot of pain. So I developed a lot of very strange rules around food. I got very scared of particular foods, and I also associated bad things with any food that I had eaten and then felt bad after. So my diet was incredibly restricted. Unfortunately, a couple of the foods that ended up getting bad labels from me were ice cream and pizza, so it was a really sad time. Side note, people with eating disorders can eat pizza and ice cream and often do still like pizza and ice cream. It can just be really hard for us to eat them and enjoy them sometimes. I also developed emetophobia and OCD when I was 12 after a non-chronic illness that I experienced, and that further restricted my intake even before I developed anorexia. So when I was diagnosed as celiac in January 2008, I knew which food groups had been causing that pain and had been causing the range of health issues that I'd experienced because of that. But my emetophobia and my OCD were never properly treated, so I actually still have those to this day. The emetophobia isn't as bad as it used to be, thank God. And the OCD isn't either, but it's definitely still present, and it's something that I still experience and I still have to try and live with or fight with, depending on how I'm feeling about it, each day. My eating disorder developed fully after I was sexually assaulted when I was 18. And I think for me, it has a lot to do with the disgust and the fear that I projected towards my own body because of what it had been through. And the control element of the eating disorder was something to channel all of those feelings into because I didn't know what to do with them. And I think that's quite a common experience for people with eating disorders. Once we start to go through treatment and we start to recover from it, we start to understand more of why we felt we needed control over something. And for a lot of us, food was the one area that we felt we could fully control. So that was what we ended up focusing all of our energy on. And that is really hard to unpick. So this next section does have a trigger warning on it for potential TMI and also for medical information and discussion of what happened when I was in the depths of my eating disorder. If that's likely to be triggering for you, please don't watch this section. I will put timestamps in the bottom to when I move on to the myth busting section and talking about treatment and all of those kind of things. I really want to encourage you not to watch this if you're going to find it difficult or triggering. So, When I got diagnosed with anorexia, it was because I had pushed my body to the point where it was starting to shut down. I was very confused at that stage. I didn't think I had an eating disorder, which I think is also a really common experience. And I ended up being hospitalised in a general hospital because my GP could see how much stress my body was under. And I think that shock and that experience of finding myself in a hospital with my ability to leave taken away, being told all of these terrifying things, finally sort of woke me up to what I'd been doing. I don't know how common this experience that I'm going to describe next is, and part of my reason I think for putting this video out onto the internet is because I'm curious to see if other people have had this experience and if this is more to do with eating disorders or if it's more to do with my BPD, because I really don't know, and I'm very curious to find out, because at the moment I'm kind of scared to talk about this sort of thing because I don't know if people are going to tell me that, you know, that's not because of the eating disorder, that doesn't relate to this. And it's a weird feeling to not know where actions or feelings came from. So if anyone is able to clarify in any way for me, that would be great, or offer like questions I can ask myself, because I'm aware that, you know, you can't see inside my head. When I got diagnosed with anorexia, it was because I had pushed my body to the point where it was starting to shut down, and I ended up in general hospital for about 2.5 weeks. Looking back, I'm fairly sure I felt trapped, and not eating and starving myself was a way of slowly committing suicide, or slowly attempting suicide, because I don't normally like it when people use committing. But it was a final test of self-control that I was putting myself through, and I think part of me just wanted to see what would happen, because I felt so out of control in my life that I think part of me didn't believe that it was possible for me to die, possible for me to have that level of control over my own body and my own life. So it was a real shock to me when my GP and when the doctors in the hospital told me how much damage I'd done to my body and how much danger I was in at the time, because I felt so powerless that I didn't think it was possible for me to perform any kind of action that had any consequence. It sounds really strange, but it made sense to me at the time that so many things had happened to me that I'd had no control over. Why should my actions now be any different? And I think part of me did want to see if anyone would step in. Part of me wanted to feel less alone and feel like someone cared, and I don't know whether that's more of my BPD driving that was undiagnosed at the time as well, or whether that was the eating disorder, and whether part of my eating disorder is me not feeling worthy of food and worthy of survival, and therefore also not feeling worthy of someone else caring about me. So I think there was part of me that was very much hoping that someone would stop me, but at the same time I didn't really believe that I was going to get to the point that I got to, or the point that I was eventually intending to get to. So here are some slightly gross and slightly TMI, definitely not fun facts. So when I was admitted to hospital, I was addicted to laxatives. I had been abusing laxatives for a good number of months at that point, and it actually started off with those flat tummy teas that you see people posting about on Instagram all the time, which is one of the many reasons why I dislike those teas so much. They are not good for you, they are just laxatives. There is no detox. Your organs do that, and if they don't, that's because you have a medical condition and your doctor will advise you on the best way to supplement that function. You do not need the flat tummy tea. Don't buy it. It will just cause you pain. So, as a result of my habitual laxative abuse, there was no food in my system at all. But because I was still taking the laxatives, my digestive system was still trying to do its thing, I did warn you this was going to be TMI. And what was coming out of that end was green, which really freaked me out at the time. So I quietly told a nurse, and she was like, yeah, that's because there's nothing in your system. It's the food that makes it the colour that it normally is. So yours is green now. I felt like an alien. I didn't know that was possible. Up until that point, I'd done like GCSE biology. Okay, I had no idea how digestive systems work, and I certainly didn't know that that was possible. And then, on a slightly more serious note, I was so dehydrated because I hadn't been allowing myself liquids either, as well as not allowing myself food. So I was so dehydrated that they had to call the vascular access team to do an ultrasound scan on my arm so that they could try and access a vein, because despite the tourniquet that they put on and all their other attempts, they couldn't get access to any of my veins. And they told me that if this didn't work and the vascular access team weren't able to get something in my arm, the next stage would be going in through my neck. I am incredibly glad that that didn't have to happen, and that is the reality of what eating disorders can do to your body. Then they tested my blood sugar once they finally had vascular access, and they found that my blood sugar was 1.9, which they were so shocked by, and I didn't really understand blood sugar levels at the time, so I didn't know what it was supposed to be. But they were so shocked by that they tested it repeatedly over the next hour or so, and all of the readings showed 1.9. Once they were sure of it, a doctor came and spoke to me and told me that at that reading I should be in a coma. It's terrifying to think about that now, but at the time when the doctor told me that, I was pleased. And I can say that now, and I can admit that now, and even though there is still part of me that's like, that makes no sense, I understand, and I have some compassion for myself back then and what my brain was going through, but I think people need to understand that that's how your brain processes things when you have an eating disorder. If someone tells you they're worried about you, if someone tells you that, you know, you're so skinny it looks like you're gonna die, the eating disorder in your brain is pleased by that, because the driving force of the eating disorder is to be as small as possible. It's to take up as little room as possible. It's to be as tiny as possible. And I think part of that, at least for me, I can't speak for anyone else, but part of that for me was because I wanted people to worry. I wanted someone to see what I was going through, because despite all the things that I'd been through over the past few years, nobody had really taken it seriously or asked me if I was okay. And this was a way of getting help, a very loud and scary way of getting help. But at the time, it was the only thing that I could think to do. I also want to add that the majority of somebody's eating disorder, it's not a conscious choice. It is not at all a choice that they are making. They're not trying to manipulate you. Everything that I'm describing about the way my brain was processing things at the time is thinking back in hindsight about what the eating disorder wanted. It's not that I was consciously thinking about these things back then and then making the choice to act in a given way. So the final couple of not so fun facts. When I started eating again, my body went into a sort of shock and I got refeeding syndrome, which was originally documented, I believe, in soldiers who came back from the war, and they'd been existing on such small rations up until the point of them coming home that their bodies no longer knew how to digest and process food. So when they ate, their body went into shock and it starts to pull nutrients in all sorts of weird places, and your digestive system freaks out and basically tries to get rid of everything, which is a really horrible experience and very painful. But as part of that refeeding syndrome, I ended up needing a potassium drip, which I was put on to stop me going into cardiac arrest, which is one of the things that can happen if your potassium levels drop too low. So I was on that drip for over 24 hours, and at 3 a.m. on one of the days I was on it, it started leaking out of my arm and all over the bed, all over the bed sheets, all over my pajamas. So I was just sitting there doused in potassium, pushing the call button for the nurse whilst watching potassium gently drip out of my arm, which was an experience. So the nurse eventually came over and took the drip out of my arm, and then I had to wait for the on-call doctor to eventually come around to put a new IV in, which if you've ever had an IV put in your arm, it's not the most fun experience, and certainly not when you're half asleep at 4 a.m. And understandably, I wasn't that high on the on-call doctor's list of priorities at that point, because I was reasonably stable. I had some food intake, I'd had some of the potassium drip. So the nurse kept coming around and waking me up every half an hour just in case the doctor came back round. And then the last not so fun thing was I got reactive hypoglycemia. So my blood sugar was really low when I first came in, and then even once I started eating again and taking supplement drinks and all of those kind of things, my body was so freaked out basically by what had been going on that my blood sugar kept plummeting and I would almost pass out. So I ended up having to walk around with a blood glucose testing kit, and I would have nurses wake me up every hour throughout the night to prick my finger and test my blood sugar. And if it was too low, they would have to fully wake me up so I could take either a glucose tablet or some other form of sugar to re-stabilize my blood sugars. All in all, I ended up being in hospital for about 2.5 weeks, and I'm pretty sure I was only discharged because I lied to the psychologist who came and assessed me because I was so scared of being sectioned. When I was first brought into the hospital, I was so desperate to leave because I was supposed to be going home in a couple of days that I kept trying to get up and walk out, and they threatened to section me multiple times during that period. So when the psychologist then assessed me, I was terrified that I was going to get sectioned. So I lied through my teeth. And I do not recommend doing that at all. That's why I pull that face while I'm saying it. Don't lie to the professional who's coming to assess you. Literally all they want to do is help. And I did not help myself by lying. I personally think I would have got my diagnosis of BPD a lot sooner if I hadn't lied to that psychologist, and I potentially would have got help and treatment much sooner. There is also the flip side that I then probably wouldn't be living the life I'm living now, and I wouldn't trade this for anything. I wouldn't trade my partner for anything. I wouldn't trade where I'm living. I wouldn't change anything except for maybe getting help earlier. If I could keep everything else the same and just go back in time and get help sooner, I definitely would. But that is with the gift of hindsight, and at the time it's often really difficult to accept help. I definitely wasn't in the mind frame for it at the time. So despite the incredibly stressful experience that being in hospital was, despite the one-on-ones, despite having someone with me every time I went to the bathroom and every time I showered, and despite being on bed rest and having to use a wheelchair for the entirety of that 2.5 weeks, I was really lucky that it was only 2.5 weeks and that I then did end up going home. I did end up dropping out of the course I was on at the time. When I was hospitalised, I was in my first year at uni in Exeter, and that was my first attempt at getting a degree. I managed it on the second time round. There were a few bumps in the road even then, but yeah, when I was hospitalised for my eating disorder, I had to drop out of uni and I moved back home for a period of time. And there are more stories and there's more detail I can go into about the recovery process that I went through and what treatment I was offered and all of those kind of things, but that's not something that I'm going to go into detail in this video. I do just think it's important to note how much of an impact eating disorders can have on your life and on your ability to study or to work. And while I want to say that to encourage people to keep trying with recovery and to grab hold of any treatment that you're offered with both hands, I also want to reassure you that it's okay if you need to drop out for a period of time, or if you can't work for a period of time. It's not your fault. You're not doing anything wrong. By dropping out or by taking a break, sometimes that's the best thing you can do to take care of yourself. It was definitely the best thing that I did for myself at that point. I couldn't cope with being in uni and being in recovery at the same time. So I took a break, and then the next time I went back to uni, I managed it. As I said, it was still bumpy, but taking that break allowed me to get to a point where I could then coast a little bit more and I could handle it. And I just really want to emphasize that it's okay to take a break. I still struggle with my eating because of the anorexia, because of my OCD, and because of the celiac disease. Having a chronic illness definitely adds a whole nother element of complication and frustration to having issues around eating. Right now, I'm also not in treatment for my eating disorder, and I've never actually received treatment that's directly for my eating disorder. The therapy program I'm in at the moment is for BPD, and while my team do keep an eye on my weight and my behaviours and things like that, it's not targeted therapy for eating disorders, and I think that's something I'll definitely try and access when this therapy program comes to an end. I hope that one day I will be able to say that I'm fully recovered from anorexia, and I know it is possible, and I've seen other people achieve it, and I've seen how much more freedom it gives them and how much less stress they have in their life because of that, and that is something that I definitely want. And I know I mentioned earlier that I would put some pictures up to show the contrast between me in the depths of my eating disorder and me now, partway through recovery, definitely doing better, but also not fully recovered. So this is the trigger warning for the pictures that I'm going to show. I really hope they're not triggering, but I'll put timestamps below, and if you're at all concerned that they might be triggering for you, I definitely encourage you to go and click on that timestamp, skip over them. You don't need to look at my face anymore than you already have been during this video. It's fine, you're not missing much, I promise. The purpose of your life is not to be as small as possible, and I promise you will find other areas that give you that feeling of agency and of control that the eating disorder tells you only it can give. So, we're going to end this video with some myth busting. Here are 5 facts you should know. Number 1, eating disorders are not just about weight. Number 2, not everyone with an eating disorder has anorexia. There are multiple types of eating disorders, and I'll put some information in the box below if you want to find out more about what other types of eating disorders there are. Just to give a quick example, some other types are binge eating disorder, avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, and bulimia. Number 3, not everyone with an eating disorder is going to be underweight. This relates to my last point, but I really want to emphasize to you that someone's weight and the way that their body looks is not at all indicative of the level of suffering that they might be experiencing, and it also doesn't indicate how bad their eating disorder is, or how much attention you should pay to it, or how worried you should be. Eating disorders are dangerous, and people need help regardless of how they look outwardly. Number 4, eating disorders are not a choice. Someone isn't choosing to have an eating disorder, and they can't just snap out of it. It's not for attention, and it's not a diet. Number 5, eating disorders do not just affect women. Recent studies suggest that around 1/3 of people with eating disorders are male. However, these studies only take into account people with a diagnosis, so the number of men with eating disorders is likely to be higher than that, as a lot of men don't feel comfortable seeking treatment. These studies also only take into account binary genders, so they are a misrepresentation of the range of people who actually suffer from eating disorders. If someone in your life either has a diagnosis of an eating disorder or seems to be struggling with disordered eating, my main advice would be to speak to them about the best ways that you can support them, and definitely encourage them to seek professional help, because there are good people out there who can help you. Try not to comment on their weight or their appearance or how much they're eating. Support them as a person, encourage them to keep engaging with friends and engaging with their hobbies, and just let them know that you'll be there for them through the whole journey. People can recover. It's tough, but if you're supporting someone or if you're allowing yourself to be supported, you're doing a great job. Okay, feel free to subscribe to my channel if you enjoyed this video. I post a lot of content talking about BPD and other mental illnesses, including, as you've seen today, my messy experiences with eating disorders. I'm trying to build a community where people feel that they can come together and talk about their experiences without any of the stigma that I know so many of us still face in society in general. I believe that through education and through talking to people about our experiences, we can reduce stigma, and that will make life and recovering from any illness so much easier. I hope you're doing well, I love you, and I'll speak to you soon. Bye!